All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into the work of this Dr. Sam Neymotin. And gotta say, the CV, wow, it's a bit intimidating even for someone like me who, reads about this stuff all the time. It's just publication after publication, grants from like the NIH and wait, did I see you worked with the US Army?
Yeah, and Google too. It's pretty impressive.
It's like how does one brain even hold all that?
Well, think of an academic CV like it's kind of like a highlight reel of a researcher's whole career, all the big stuff.
Right, right.
Those publications tell you what they've actually contributed to their field.
Yeah.
The funding shows you what questions people think are really important, the groundbreaking stuff, and all those affiliations. Those paint a picture of like their whole journey, their impact on the research world.
Yeah, it's like a roadmap almost.
And Neymotin's, I gotta say, it's screaming rock star researcher.
Okay, so let's try to break this down a bit. So he's been at the Nathan Klein Institute for Psychiatric Research for a while now, but he's also held positions at Brown, Yale. I mean, this R&B research lab thing, that's super interesting. What was he doing with the Army?
Well, when you start connecting the dots, it starts to make sense. Neymotin, he specializes in this really fascinating area, computational modeling of brain circuits. Basically, he uses computers to try and simulate how our brains work.
Oh, wow. So it's like
Like,
he's building digital brains.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And that has huge GE implications for all sorts of things. Artificial intelligence, understanding neurological conditions, and yeah, even military tech.
So those Google Cloud credits on his CV.
Makes you wonder what they're up to, right?
Seriously, are we talking brain-computer interfaces here? AI-powered defense systems?
Could be, all stemming from this kind of research.
I never would have guessed that those things were all connected.
It really highlights how far-reaching this research can be.
Okay, so now I'm even more curious about the actual research itself. I've got to admit, this paper you sent over, the title alone, Training Spiking Neuronal Networks to Perform Motor Control, Using Reinforcement and Evolutionary Learning. I'm not going to lie, it's a little intimidating.
Mouthful, that's for sure.
Can we maybe, break down what that actually means in plain English?
Absolutely. And don't worry, it's way less scary than it sounds. It all boils down to this fascinating area of neuroscience called spiking neural networks, or SNNs for short. They're kind of like the cool new kids on the block compared to the more common artificial neural networks, or ANNs, that you might have heard of.
Okay, so what makes these spiking networks so special? What are they all about?
Okay, so picture a neuron, right?
Yeah.
Like a tiny little messenger in your brain, sending electrical signals to other neurons. Now, most artificial intelligence uses those ANNs, and they're good at certain tasks, but they don't really process information the same way our brains do.
How so?
They're kind of like a light switch, either on or off. But in our brains, it's much more complex than that.
Hmm.
Neurons talk to each other through the little pulses of electricity called spikes, and the timing of those spikes actually matters. It's like a secret code.
Whoa, so it's not just about the signal itself, but when it's sent.
Exactly. And SNNs, they try to capture that complexity, making them potentially way more powerful than those traditional ANNs.
That's incredible. So it's like each spike is carrying a specific piece of information.
Precisely. And that's what Neymotin is trying to figure out, how to understand and harness this really intricate language of the brain. Of course, it's not without its challenges.
Oh, I bet. I can only imagine those timing things must make SNNs way harder to actually train.
You got it.
It's not just adjusting the volume, you're trying to fine-tune this whole orchestra of signals, right?
That's a great way to put it. It's like conducting an orchestra where each musician is a neuron, and the music they create is a thought, an action, a memory. It's incredibly complex,
Yeah.
but that's where the real breakthrough lies.
So I'm seeing in this paper that Neymotin's working on train these networks for something called motor control. What exactly does that mean in this context?
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
well, it sounds kind of self-explanatory, right? Motor
Well,
control.
yeah.
But of course, with these spiking neural networks, it gets a lot more complicated than like me telling my hand to grab this coffee cup, I'm sure.
Right.
In this context, motor control, it's really about all those amazingly intricate ways our brains plan and then actually execute movements,
Yeah.
coordinating muscles, timing, sensory feedback. It's mind-boggling how much is happening in just milliseconds.
So how do you even begin to teach a network of these spiking neurons to do something that complex that fast?
That's the question. And Neymotin, he uses this classic problem in computational neuroscience and robotics, actually, called cart pull.
Cart pull. Okay, I have no idea what that is. Paint me a picture here.
All right, so picture this, a little cart, like a tiny one, on a track. And on top of that cart, you've got a pole balanced upright. The goal is to keep that pole from tipping over by moving the cart, left to right.
Oh, okay. Like it seems pretty simple when you put it like that.
You'd think, right?
Yeah.
Deceptively simple. But cart pole, it actually gets at something really fundamental about motor control. This whole challenge of maintaining stability in like a world that's constantly changing.
It's like, one of those games you'd see in those old school arcades,
Oh,
right? Like
yeah.
just frantically trying to keep things balanced.
Exactly. That kind of balancing act.
Huh.
But now we're talking about getting a network of these spiking neurons to pull it off.
Right, right. So how does this cart pole thing, how does it actually translate to training the SNNs?
Think of it like a virtual training ground, a simulation where these networks can learn. Neymotin and his team, they basically created these SNNs and tasked them with controlling the cart,
Right.
keeping that pole upright.
Oh, okay.
And their success or failure in doing that, well, it tells us a lot about how well the SNN is learning, how it's adapting its motor control strategy.
So it's like, I don't know, training a digital dog to do tricks, but instead of fetching, they're mastering this art of balance.
Exactly.
And I see in the paper they're using these two specific ways of training these networks, STDPRL and EVOL. And I think we touched on those acronyms earlier, but those seem to be kind of at the heart of this whole learning process, right?
100%. They represent two really different approaches to learning. And we're not just talking about SNNs here, potentially even in our own brains.
Okay. Well, now I definitely need to hear more about each one. What makes them so unique?
Okay, so we've got these two training methods, STDPRL and EVOL, and they each have a different approach to teaching these, what do you call them, SNNs, to basically master this whole cart pole balance thing.
Right, yeah.
Like we're stepping into a neural gym here. So where do we even begin to unpack these acronyms?
Well, let's start with STDPRL. That stands for Spike Timing Dependent Reinforcement Learning.
Catchy, very
Yeah.
catchy. Yeah. But, behind the jargon, it's actually a pretty simple concept. It's all about, learning through rewards and punishments. Remember how we were talking about those precisely timed spikes and how they're like a neural code?
Yeah, like a secret language the neurons use.
Exactly. So imagine this. A neuron, it fires a spike right before another neuron, and that little sequence, it leads to something good in the cart pole game, right? Like say the pole stays balanced. What happens is that connection between those two neurons, it actually gets stronger.
Oh, wow, okay.
It's like the network is saying, hey, that little spike pattern, that worked. Let's do that more often.
Right.
But if a spike pattern leads to, the pole totally wiping out,
Yeah.
well, that connection, if it gets weaker. So the network, it learns to avoid that sequence.
Interesting.
So this constant tweaking of these connections based on whether things go right or wrong, that's basically STDPRL in a nutshell.
So it's almost like we're training a dog with treats, but it's happening like at the level of individual brain cells.
Exactly.
That's wild. Okay, but evol, that's a whole other thing, right?
Yeah, evol, evolutionary strategies. That one takes its inspiration from, well, evolution itself.
Okay.
Survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
But for, neural networks.
Okay, now you've really got me curious. How does a network evolve? Like, I don't get it.
So imagine this. You create a whole bunch of slightly different versions of our SNN.
Okay.
Each one has its own unique way of connecting those spiking neurons.
Okay, yeah.
We kind of throw them all at the cart pole problem, see what happens.
Right, so some are going to be good, some are going to be terrible.
Exactly. Some will be terrible. Some might be, I don't know, mediocre, we'll say.
Mm-hmm.
And then a few, they might just totally surprise us with how well they can balance this thing.
Right, the naturals.
Exactly. They're naturals. So then, here's the key,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We look at those top performers,
Mm-hmm.
the ones who are just crushing it, and we take their connection patterns.
Oh, okay.
It's like their neural DNA, right?
Right.
And we use that to build the next generation of these networks. So now those offspring, they're inheriting all those winning traits, and then we just repeat the whole process over and over again.
So it's like we're breeding them to be better.
Exactly. Like breeding champion racehorses, but instead of speed, it's cart pole mastery.
Right, of course. Who needs speed?
And over generations, this whole process leads to some incredibly efficient and robust networks.
Wow, it's really elegant when you think about it.
Yeah.
So we've got STDPRL, which is that precise, reward and punishment system. And then we have EVOL, this more hands-off approach of just letting these networks figure it out on their own over time. It's really amazing to think that these strategies might actually be how our brains are learning too.
Right. It makes you wonder.
It really does. And here's the kicker, okay? The paper actually found that evol did better. It outperformed the STDP-RL in this cartpole thing. So what's the takeaway there? Why would that be?
Well, I think it comes down to this really fundamental difference in how these learning mechanisms actually operate.
Hmm.
STDPRL, it's very focused on the short term, right?
Okay.
It strengthens or weakens those connections based on immediate feedback. Like, did this one action make the pole wobble or did it, stay put?
Right.
But evol, because it's looking at performance over these like many, many generations, it
Yeah.
can actually make changes that might not have like an immediate payoff, you know?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But those changes might lead to a much stronger, more adaptable strategy in the long run.
So it's less about like reacting to every little wobble and more about developing an overall strategy, like a game plan for balance.
Exactly. And that could be why those evol train networks ended up, being more successful. They weren't just reacting. They were learning to actually anticipate and then adjust their whole strategies based on this like much deeper understanding of how the whole system works.
Wow. It makes you think, could could our brains actually be using similar mechanisms, maybe like on different time scales? Like some types of learning are more about that gradual refinement over time, while others are like those quick adaptations.
That's a great question. And honestly, that's exactly the kind of question that this kind of research really makes us ask.
Hmm.
We've known for a long time that the brain has this thing called synaptic plasticity,
Mm.
which is, it's that ability of those connections between neurons to get stronger or weaker over time.
Right, right.
It's how we learn, how we form memories. But what this research is suggesting is that maybe there are like different types of synaptic plasticity happening.
Oh, interesting.
Some are happening really fast on those short timescales like STD-PRL.
Right.
And others, they're working much slower over these longer timescales like evol. It
Wow.
could be why we learn some things super quick, just through immediate feedback.
Right.
But other things, they take like way more time, more practice, and a more, big picture understanding before we can really master them.
Huh. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. It's like we're actually seeing evolution in action, but instead of like, shaping beaks and feathers, it's actually shaping the connections in our brains.
Pretty mind-blowing.
And to think like all this just from watching a little virtual pole try really hard not to fall over, it's incredible.
It really is. It's a simple problem.
Yeah.
But the potential insights, they're huge. We're talking about the core of learning here,
Yeah.
biological and artificial.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. I mean, Neymotin's work is really, it's opening up this whole new world of possibilities, right? It's not just about like building smarter AI, but it's about understanding like the very essence of what it means to learn.
100%.
I mean, imagine if we can crack the code of how these SNNs learn and adapt, who knows what we could achieve.
The possibilities are pretty much endless.
New ways to, I don't know, enhance our own brains, boost our cognitive abilities, maybe even therapies for people with neurological conditions. It's really exciting to think about, and I, for one, can't wait to see what comes next.